Are you an early stage founder revolutionizing the future of retail? Then you're in the right place. My name is Sapna Shah, and I'm an angel investor investing at the pre-seed and seed stage in retail tech, e-commerce, marketplaces, and consumer. I'm also the founder of Retail X Series, an ecosystem to help early stage founders in the retail and consumer sectors. Retail X Series includes a YouTube channel, a Slack community, resources for founders, and this podcast. In this podcast, I interview founders, investors, and experts in the retail space, and we dig deep into the tactics around key topics that early stage founders want to hear about. Welcome to the Retail X podcast. Hello, everyone. Today's episode is all about fundraising, and in particular, raising a pre-seed round in the current fundraising climate. Our guest today is Wehren, founder and CEO of Inseam. Anne will share her experience in fundraising during the spring and summer of 2023, including finding a lead, dealing with the no's, and more. Welcome to the podcast, Anne.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So happy to have you. And I think you have a very good story and a lot of good tips for our audience. So let's start with some background. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
For sure. So I've lived here in New York City and worked on the commercial side in the fashion industry for 18 years. I worked in wholesale sales for 13 years, including time working as a consultant in collection development, merchandising, positioning, and sales strategies for all channels. I also have covered multi-buying in a role for a luxury store that had 6 doors in 5 markets, and I covered a 100 vendor matrix there.
Okay, amazing. So a lot of relevant background as we get into the next question, which is tell us more about Inseam and what Inseam does, a little bit about when you launched, just a little bit of stage setting before we talk about fundraising.
Yeah, for sure. So Inseam is a private marketplace and sourcing toolkit for the connectors whose relationships power the luxury fashion industry. So our model connects designer brands directly to the most valuable clients who purchase the majority of luxury by leveraging the personal relationships that those clients purchase through. So when we say connectors, we mean personal shoppers, personal stylists, sales personnel, anyone that has a selling relationship with an end client. And when you think about the retail landscape, it's really designed for one-to-one shopping, like you and I walking into a store, buying something on our own online. And at the luxury segment, that's just not the behavior that drives the majority of sales. The majority of full price sales move through these personal relationships that are a bit more behind the scenes with clients that often never even walk into a store or touch a website because they are busy running companies and running their families, and they simply don't have time. So we know that the top 2% of clients purchase 50% of luxury transaction volume globally. And those are the folks that work with these connectors, and the connectors essentially have no platform given that their value has never been recognized. And the industry is built for direct shopping. So there is no B2B model. So we are the first platform that supports these behind the scenes connectors. And we do this through connecting them with designer direct access, a universal cart, sourcing tools to share product with their clients, and the terms they need to get product in front of their clients, which include try before you buy, often payment terms for the client, and commissions back to the connector. I launched the business in 2020, and I bootstrapped the company for 2 years. Then I raised from 3 angels within the fashion industry in the spring of 2022. Then last winter, in the fall of 2022, I went through Techstars New York. And then this past spring of 23, I launched a round and closed that this summer. So I've raised a total of 2 million in that year and a half, just over a year time period. So I raised 180K in essentially a friends and family round that was on a rolling basis from the spring of 22 to when I launched my round this spring. And that includes the 120K that I took in from Techstars, and then raised 1.7 in a 3 to 4 month process that I launched this spring.
Okay, amazing background. And we're going to get into the process in a second. But thank you for sharing what your platform does, because I think and maybe this is even what I said to you when we first met after your fundraise, was that these kinds of businesses are really hard to fundraise for, because this isn't a business that traditionally people understand, especially that piece of the luxury customer and how they shop. It is news to a lot of people, including investors. So there's a lot of sort of education you have to do. So now let's start talking about this pre-seed round, this kind of 1.7 million that you raised, and let's just walk through step by step. First, I kind of want to say, why did you need to raise? But I think we know, because you didn't really have any money before. But I guess tell me what you were raising for.
Sure. I had been bootstrapping, and I had profitable unit economics, and we were transacting revenue. So I was in the market, we were launched, and it was just me for the first couple years. So we were chugging along, and I could continue to do that, or I could raise outside capital and grow the business. And I didn't just assume that I was going to raise outside capital just because I had a new business. I was very careful to have profitable unit economics for that reason, so that I could really decide how I wanted to capitalize the business and when. So I started thinking about fundraising in the summer of 21. I got in touch with a fundraising coach who put me in touch with someone that develops financial models. So I started working with him, and we essentially rolled out a bootstrapping case and a raise case. And seeing the growth that was possible with the capital infusion felt most aligned with what I wanted for myself and the company. So it was not a decision I took lightly, but it was one that I made with a combination of data analysis and soul searching.
Love that. I think you rarely hear that founders make this kind of bootstrap case and the raise case. I think a lot of times you do those mental gymnastics, but don't actually put it down on paper. So love that. As a former investment banker, I love that there were two models. Okay, so you decided that the going out to raise was the right move and very aligned with what you wanted to do. How did you decide how much to raise? I think this is a question that comes up all the time with founders. I think a lot of times it's like put a finger in the air and a number pops up. Maybe it's a million, maybe it's 1.5 million, maybe it's 2 million. How did you get to your number?
Yeah, so I knew that revenues around 100 million in year 5 was the goal. And I knew that from taking a course called Fundraising 101 that's run by a company called Class Rebel, which I cannot recommend more highly. It's a live course. It's 8 hours. It's only $99. It's pay once, attend forever. And that really started to lay the foundation for everything I learned about venture. It's like venture deals on steroids, and it teaches you the language of venture. So I knew that was the target. And it was also from working with the very experienced financial modeler who helped me with the model. So we rolled out a raise case was based on a $500,000 raise for the first round. And I didn't even get there. I raised 300,000 over a year, and that included 120 from Techstars. that was the original goal. And then for this most recent round, I had this 100 million in year 5 goal in mind. We had improving and growing revenues at this point, but still teeny compared to 100 million goal. And I knew I wanted to raise between 2 and 3 million, but then I also needed to be flexible. So when the market was telling me that I wasn't going to get a term sheet for a priced round between 2 and 3 million, I went back to the model. I cut expenses and said, all right, we can do this. Let's raise 1 million. So then I went out to raise 1 million and ended up raising 1.7, oversubscribed, and landed somewhat closer to where I had started around the 2.
That's amazing. So I want to highlight two things here that I feel like you took this so seriously that you almost went back to school, right? You worked with an experienced modeler, you had a fundraising coach, you took this class, which by the way, we'll put a link to it in the show notes. You really did your homework before you even started, really, which I love. I think that contributed to the success that you had in raising. But before we get to success, besides doing these things, the fundraising coach, the modeler, the class, how else did you prepare for funding, knowing that you were still early stage? And as you said yourself, you had teeny revenues at the time. What else obviously you had to get a pitch deck together, but what else did you have to do to be ready?
So I mentioned that I took the Class Rebel course a couple times. I took it live. I also watched the recordings and referenced the course materials frequently. I had the fundraising coach. I also went through Techstars, and they really hold your hand in helping you prep your materials, and they help you get your whole data room in order. So by the time I closed the program, I wanted to launch the round immediately, and I was pretty much ready. It took a couple more weeks of prep, and it was really lining up the warm intros. And yeah, I was ready. Techstars gets you ready to raise a seed. That is what they do. That's their whole model.
That's great. And you mentioned the warm intro. So I want to get more into that. You had mentioned to me before that you had lined up 250 warm intros, which seems like just so many. It's overwhelming. How did you do that? And what was critical in writing those email intros? And what were those elements of success?
So going back to preparing the outreach from the Techstars list. So I had my own list of every investor I had ever heard of that deploys somewhat near my space. Then the MD of our Techstars program has their own list of their own relationships that they're able to make warm intros for you for. During the program, I had my VA pull in from their list any investor that touches marketplaces, e-commerce, CPG enablement, future of retail, women founders, future of work. Then I spent 2 days researching every specific partner on that list to write a customized sentence about why I wanted to meet with that partner specifically, because of their experience in X, because they invested in Y, whatever it was. That way I could have my VA queue up the 250 warm intros with the custom sentence for each particular partner. And we did this all through spreadsheets. So of course I had my private spreadsheet pipeline where I have all of my personal notes. And then I also had a public spreadsheet that I would send to mentors and screen share with mentors and advisors to see where they can help make intros. So the MD team at Techstars made 200 of the 250 warm intros. But before they did that, in the weeks leading up to that, I was hopping on calls with mentors and advisors, screen sharing that list, sending that list to them saying, hey, it looks like you're connected with these 5 people on LinkedIn. I put their name in a cell next to that partner's name with a question mark. If they were willing to make that intro, they just had to delete the question mark, and then they could browse through my list and add their name to anyone else that they knew that I didn't know that they were connected to. So I lined up another 50 intros through about 25 other people that offered to help. So then my VA was able to send the intro templates for them to forward. All 250 went out in a day with a specific day that we asked them to send them. So they were all really sent in a 24 to 48 hour window.
That is a crazy story and awesome. So let me ask you though, so if you had a case, because this has happened and I've gotten questions about this from founders before, where let's say you had a Techstars intro and some other mentor advisor intro. Did you send out two intros to the same investor, like two separate? Or did you save one of them in your back pocket in case you needed a nudge or something else? Or did you just pick one?
Oh no, hell yes. You send them all on the same day, because then I was getting on the phone with investors that were literally listing the number of people. Hey, this person and this person all told me to talk to you. So you want to attack them from all sides at the same time. And then if I needed a nudge, I would go back to whoever I think had the strongest connection and whoever would get a response.
I love that. That's so great. You basically blanketed the market in 24 hours, all about InSeam. I love it. Okay, so you sent out 250 email intros, and then you started meeting with investors during the spring of 2023. We are sitting here right before Thanksgiving 2023 talking about this, so just to give a little context. And the spring of 2023 was a really slow time for fundraising, really at all stages, but certainly at the later stages. So I'm very interested to hear how you actually work the process. So let's start with having those first meetings or calls with investors. What did you learn about what worked and what didn't work in your pitch?
First off, in terms of the timing, I knew that it was probably not an ideal time, but I also had the momentum of raising right after Techstars, because during Techstars, you're introduced to 80 to 100 mentors, and half of them are investors. So you're sending them weekly updates during the program. And I also had growing revenues. And my whole story, because I'm a solo non-technical founder without a technical co-founder and didn't have proprietary tech, we had a no code MVP. My whole narrative was traction, and I had a growing business and I had to capitalize it. So it was like, you got to get on this rocket ship now. I don't care what's happening in the capital markets. We're headed to outer space. So now is the time. And I am really glad that I launched the round as close to Techstars as possible. And then during the calls, I think I got slightly better in the first batch. I would say I pitched 50 funds in the first 5 weeks. And I think I, over time, got better at controlling the narrative, not letting them barrage me with questions, because I just didn't want to get off the call without me getting the story across and getting across how massive this opportunity is. And whether I stuck to the deck or not, I somewhat followed their lead, but I also didn't let them run me over.
That's great advice, actually, because I do think that a lot of times you go into one of those meetings, you have a pitch, the investor asks a question, you go off the rails into some rabbit hole, and then poof, your time is over.
Yeah, you have to take advantage. The time goes very quickly. And I do appreciate that investors on Zoom just want to get down to business. It's not as great for, it's not as helpful for building in-person connections like you would if you met at a coffee shop and you spend the first 5 minutes talking about the weather and how you got there and maybe what their kids did that morning. But everyone's looking at the clock, everyone has another meeting, and you have to make the best of the time. You gotta get right into it.
Yeah, that's great advice. Okay, so that was a lot of calls and Zooms. How did you keep yourself motivated through the process?
I love sales. And so I'm naturally really energized by talking to people about what I'm offering and what value I can provide them. And I also had a practice that my fundraising coach had instructed me on, which is a pump up process, which is playing loud, energizing music that makes you feel like a boss and makes you feel like you're going to win the big game. And I play that for a few minutes and leave my desk. And I do this before every big pitch, any meeting where I feel like I have the jitters, definitely before going on stage, before demo day. I also really focused on this process. I was really diligent about what was on my calendar, what else needed to happen in my life. Absolutely saying no to social things and anything that felt extraneous, especially on weeknights, to ensure that I got 8 to 9 hours of sleep. And then just mainlining all of the caffeine throughout.
I was wondering when the caffeine would come into it. And then how did you deal with the no's? Because of course there were no's.
Yeah, I had a lot of no's from the 250 intros that went out originally. I filed 65 no's from email intros with people that didn't even want to meet. And I loved that because I had such massive outreach. That just felt like a massive time savings of 65 meetings I'm not going to have and then eventually get to a no.
Yeah, sometimes it's so much easier just to get the no instead of the maybe strung along and then the no in a limp way later on in a tepid process.
Yeah, it was definitely easier to get the no up front because I did get emotionally attached to some of the partners that I felt I really connected with. And I felt they really were interested in what I was building. And to then get an immediate no from them felt like every Tuesday I was post Monday partner meetings, I was getting a barrage of no's. And honestly, that hurt more. So I'd rather not get emotionally involved and just get that no right off the bat.
Totally hear you. Did any of the no's ever turn into yeses?
Absolutely not. I did not try whatsoever. I just felt like every no was getting me closer to a yes that was the right investor that was aligned for me. So I tried not to think about them. If they wanted to be added to the monthly updates, I did that. I'm now moving my monthly updates to quarterly for my target investors, keeping my monthly updates for my current investors. And honestly, I only put the ones I really want on that list. So some of them just don't get added to that list.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear about you didn't bother with the no's turning into yeses, because I do think a lot of founders spend a lot of time trying to turn a no into a yes because of exactly what you said. Like you feel like a connection with the person, your company would be such a fit for them, all of those things. That is some good advice. And this newsletter thing too, super interesting. I think I'm on a variety of newsletters of people I've said no to, obviously the ones I'm an investor in and get more information, ones that were too early. But a lot of times those newsletters become very sporadic and I'll fall off that list. And maybe it's because I'm not a good fit for them, as you just mentioned. But in a breakfast meeting with a bunch of VCs once, I think there was 50 VCs in the room, and they had asked, has anyone ever said, yes, put me on your newsletter and I'll invest in a later round, and actually then did invest in the later round? Half the room put their hands up. So those newsletters really do work for later rounds. So I'm glad you're doing it.
I love to hear that. And let me just add one thing about the no's not stinging as much. I do also think it's important to have a critical mass of investors in your pipeline through the warm intros, just identifying even on a target list, even if you haven't found a path in with an intro yet. Because if your list is small, the no's are really going to burn. If you have a long list to get through, it's okay, on to the next. Thank you. Next.
Yeah, that's a great point as well. Yeah, it doesn't hurt as much when it's a lower percentage of the total, for sure. Okay, So you've been having all these meetings, you've gotten some no's, but you've gotten some interest too. And you didn't yet have a lead at one point where you had some interest. And you had a really interesting strategy that you had previously shared with me on how you got a lead investor. So can you talk through that process and how you ultimately got your lead?
Yes. So I mentioned that in the first 5 weeks, I hadn't secured a term sheet for a price round with kind of the tier one funds. I was also getting anxious about kind of losing traction by shifting my focus entirely away from the company. So I reconfigured my schedule to only raise in the afternoons and focus on the business in the morning. I also reconfigured the financial model, as I mentioned, cutting back the expenses and positioning the round as $1 million round. So then I went back to everyone who said they were interested as a follower and pitched a party round just using a standard YC safe. And I threw out a price, but I also said I was open to suggestions on the price. So then I got an offer that I considered too low of a price, but it had a 72-hour deadline. So then that allowed me to go to the lead that I really wanted, who I felt was the best fit for us, and say exactly that. Say, you're the right partner. You're the one I want to work with. Can you throw out a number that works for you? And was able to negotiate with him on that price and ultimately closed him as the lead. And then he also brought in quite a few new warm intros from his network that helped us fill out the round. And I was able to go back to the other followers with the confirmed price and him as the lead and pretty quickly close out from there.
So that's really interesting because I think a lot of times you can feel like in this process, especially being a solo founder, that you're alone and at least I got something. Let me just take it and let's just move on from this. It's been weeks, right? Weeks and weeks, and let's just keep going and build the business. But this idea of really using one term sheet to try and get the one you actually want is definitely a good strategy. And I'm so glad it worked for you. And sometimes it doesn't work too, right? You do your best.
Yeah. In Techstars, they say, and they're right, that's when the round really starts. Once you get a term sheet, then you can get another term sheet. And that's when you really see who's interested. Everyone's just scoping you out before then. Once the term sheet is in hand, you can like really play ball.
Yeah, totally. There's like a little bit of you build on that FOMO of, oh, I was not sure. I was on the fence, but now there's a term sheet and there's all these people. And yeah, there's a momentum to it for sure.
Yeah, and then it's time to hold their feet to the fire. It's time for them to make a decision, and then it's you're in or you're out, and you can move really quickly then.
Yeah. That was how you raised the round. Were there any mistakes that you made in the process that you'd like to share that others could then maybe learn by your example?
I would say I never sent out an NDA, but I do know people still think that's something you should do. I've been advised to never do that. So I never did that one. I did send out a lot of Calendly links, and I feel like this one is controversial because we all rely on Calendly links to help us streamline our calendars and our inboxes. And I didn't know that could be perceived as disrespectful to an investor. And my funding coach alerted me to that during the friends and family round. So I stopped doing that. It takes a little more back and forth, but I did just clearly block out on my calendar. So I knew exactly which time slots I wanted to book them into. And then that way my VA could help me do that as well. So I had her help with that instead of using a Calendly. But I guess during the friends and family round, sending out a Calendly made me look like an amateur. That's probably it.
It's interesting. The NDA for sure. That's just a non-starter. You're right on the Calendly. I think that is pretty controversial. I know I prefer to send my Calendly because I know what times I have and you just figure it out according to your schedule. And I don't want to look at your schedule. It's going to have a lot of times that I don't have. And I also don't do a great job managing my calendar. So my Calendly is the only accurate thing on it. So I can understand that. So this has been amazing. I have one last question. You've given a tremendous amount of advice in this podcast episode, so I really appreciate that. But is there any other kind of critical piece of advice you would give to founders as they go out to raise a round, particularly given the climate, given everything you've seen, anything we haven't discussed?
Yeah, learning how to run the process after the first meeting was something I did not know how to do at all. And I learned a few weeks late, like quite a few weeks into the process. I was connected with an incredible founder, Kelly Nyland, and she has a small fundraising guide on Notion that she shares with founders. So I'll send you that link for the show notes as well. So she has a great tip on running your meeting cadence and your follow-ups to keep things moving quickly and to get to a no or hopefully a yes in 2 to 3 meetings max and about 2 weeks from the first meeting. That is something I had no idea how to do. What do you follow up with after the first meeting? How do you drip information out? How do you book them in for the second meeting? And what are we talking about in the second meeting? What are we covering in the third meeting? So following up with, hey, I would love to cover this in the next meeting very specifically, and just moving them forward was incredibly helpful. And then I would say just running that tight process and really focusing on it, which is hard to do as a solo founder, particularly when I needed to also be running the company. But I'm really glad that I maneuvered my calendar to allow for that, because I can't imagine how this would have gone if it had just been like a trickle and just dragged on. It would have taken years, or it wouldn't have happened. So I would just say run a process and stick with it, because deploying the money to hire incredible people and grow your company is absolutely thrilling. And that's the stage I'm in now, and it's incredible.
I love that. I love both pieces of advice, and we will definitely include Kelly Nyland's link in the show notes. I think everything you've said in this episode has been so much about process and preparation. And then when you have those logistical pieces, you can actually focus on the things that matter, which is who is the right fit, and are you making that connection? Are you telling your story? All of those things. Amazing advice. And thank you so much for everything that you've shared about your fundraising journey on the podcast. I really appreciate your time.
Oh, it's my absolute pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
And thank you for listening to the Retail X podcast. We'll have another episode out shortly.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Retail X Series, check out www.retailxseries.com for more information, including recordings of past events. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Retail X Series. You could also learn more about me, find fundraising resources, or submit a pitch deck at www.redgiraffeadvisors.com. Thanks, and catch you next time.